What happens when a single father in worn clothes boards first class with his son, only to have F-22 pilots salute him hours later? This is the incredible true story of Midnight Viper, a legendary Air Force pilot whose greatest mission wasn't in the skies, but in the everyday heroism of fatherhood. Stay with me until the end to discover how one man's hidden past changed everything, and comment below what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels around the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Reagan National Airport as Connor Walsh adjusted the strap of his son's worn backpack, the duct tape holding it together, catching slightly on his calloused fingers. The weight of the military envelope in his jacket pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step toward Gate B7, its contents a stark reminder of the life he'd left behind 5 years ago. "Dad, are you sure we're supposed to be here?" Dylan whispered, his 8-year-old voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the terminal. His small hand found Connor's gripping tightly as they approached the first-class boarding line. Connor looked down at his son, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in those bright blue eyes that reminded him so painfully of Sarah. "We belong here just as much as anyone else, buddy," he said softly, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The boarding passes in his free hand, first-class seats 12F and 12E, felt like fraudulent documents, tickets to a world that had never been meant for people like them. The gate agent, a meticulously groomed woman, whose smile seemed practiced rather than genuine, barely glanced up as Connor handed over their boarding passes. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she noticed their appearance. Connor's faded jeans and Dylan's second-hand sneakers, a stark contrast to the designer luggage and expensive clothing surrounding them. "Mr. Walsh," she said, her voice carrying just the slightest hint of surprise as she processed their seat assignments. "These are first-class accommodations." "Yes," Connor replied simply, offering no explanation. He'd learned long ago that the less he said about how they'd acquired those tickets, the better. The truth, that they were a final gift from Sarah's mother before she'd written them out of her will entirely, was too complicated and too painful to explain to strangers. As they walked down the jetway, Dylan's grip on his father's hand tightened. "Dad, everyone's staring at us." Connor glanced around, noting the subtle but unmistakable looks from their fellow passengers. He recognized the expression, a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and barely concealed disdain that he'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. Since Sarah's death, since he'd left the Air Force, since their world had shrunk to just the two of them against everything else. "Let them look," Connor murmured, though his jaw clenched slightly. "We have every right to be here." The aircraft's interior was a world apart from the coach cabins Connor remembered from his rare personal flights during his military days. Rich leather seats, polished wood accents, and the soft murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. It was a glimpse into a life that felt as foreign to him as the surface of Mars. Their seats were near the front of the cabin, 2 side-by-side leather recliners that probably cost more than Connor made in 2 months at the auto shop. As they approached row 12, Connor could feel the weight of curious stares following their progress. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice from behind them. Connor turned to see a woman in her 50s, every inch of her screaming old money, from her perfectly coiffed silver hair to her Italian leather handbag. "I think there might be some mistake with your seating." Connor felt Dylan press closer to his side, and it took every ounce of his military training to keep his voice level. "No mistake, ma'am. These are our assigned seats." The woman's eyes narrowed as she took in their appearance more thoroughly. Connor's work shirt clean, but bearing the faint stains that no amount of washing could completely remove. Dylan's jeans with the carefully mended hole in the knee. The backpack that had seen better days but still faithfully carried his son's few treasures. Perhaps you should double-check with the flight attendant. She suggested, her tone suggesting it was anything but a suggestion. I'm sure there's been some sort of mix-up. Before Connor could respond, a flight attendant approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Is everything all right here? I was just suggesting that perhaps these passengers should verify their seat assignments, the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. The flight attendant glanced at Connor and Dylan, her expression subtly shifting. Of course. May I see your boarding passes? Connor handed them over, noting how the flight attendant's eyebrows rose slightly when she saw their seat assignments. She turned the passes over, examining them with unnecessary thoroughness, as if searching for evidence of forgery. These appear to be legitimate, she said finally, though her tone suggested surprise rather than satisfaction. However, I should mention that first-class passengers are expected to maintain certain standards of presentation. The words hung in the air like a slap. Dylan looked up at his father, confusion and hurt clear in his expression. Connor felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Not anger exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous. Our appearance meets airline requirements, Connor said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone that made the flight attendant take a small step back. Unless you're suggesting otherwise. There was something in his tone, a quality that spoke of authority earned in places where life and death decisions were made in split seconds, that made the flight attendant's practiced smile falter. Of course not, she said quickly. Please take your seats. We'll be departing shortly. As they settled into their seats, Connor could hear the murmur of conversations around them. Phrases drifted over. How did they afford first class? Probably frequent flyer miles. What's the world coming to? Each comment was like a small cut, not deep enough to draw blood, but persistent enough to sting. Dylan fumbled with his seatbelt, his small fingers struggling with the unfamiliar mechanism. A man across the aisle, probably in his 60s, wearing a suit that cost more than Connor's monthly rent, watched with undisguised amusement. Need help there, son? The man asked, his tone patronizing. These seats are a bit more complicated than what you're probably used to. Connor reached over to help Dylan with the belt, his movements deliberate and controlled. He's got it, he said simply, not looking at the man. I'm sure he does, the man replied with a chuckle. Just surprised to see. Well, let's just say the demographics of first class have certainly changed. The comment was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his words. Connor felt Dylan tense beside him, and something inside his chest tightened like a coiled spring. Dylan's probably flown more miles than most people in this cabin, Connor said quietly, his eyes meeting the man's for the first time. There was something in that gaze, a depth and intensity that made the older man's smile falter slightly. Oh, really? The skepticism in his voice was palpable. Connor could have told him about the military transport flights, about the times Dylan had accompanied him to air shows and ceremonies, before Sarah got sick, about the young boy's encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft that put most adults to shame. Instead, he simply nodded. Really? The man seemed to sense that he'd stumbled into deeper waters than he'd expected, and turned back to his newspaper with a dismissive grunt, but Connor could still feel the weight of curious stares from around the cabin, the whispered conversations that seemed to center on their presence. A woman in the row behind them was speaking in what she probably thought was a hushed tone to her companion. I mean, I have nothing against people like that, but first class used to mean something. Standards, you know. Probably using some sort of government assistance, her companion replied. Food stamps and welfare, and then they spend it on expensive plane tickets, instead of, I don't know, proper clothing for the child. Connor's hands clenched involuntarily, and he felt the military envelope in his pocket crinkle slightly. The irony wasn't lost on him. These people passing judgment on his worthiness to occupy a seat had no idea that he'd once been trusted with aircraft worth more than their combined net worth, that his call sign was spoken with reverence in squadron ready rooms across the Air Force. Dylan looked up at him with those two knowing eyes. Dad, why are they being mean to us? The question was like a knife to Connor's heart. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes the world judges people by the price of their clothes rather than the content of their character? How do you tell your son that some people need to feel superior to others just to feel good about themselves? Because they don't know us, Connor said simply. And sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand. A flight attendant, different from the one who'd questioned their boarding passes, began the safety demonstration. Connor noticed how her smile seemed more genuine when she looked at the other passengers, more perfunctory when her gaze swept over their row. Small slights, perhaps unconscious, but they accumulated like stones in his chest. The aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, and Connor felt the familiar thrill of impending flight despite everything else. There was something about aviation that still called to him even after all these years. The physics of lift and thrust, the delicate balance of forces that allowed tons of metal to dance through the sky. It was poetry written in mathematics and engineering. Dylan pressed his face to the window, watching the ground crew with rapt attention. Dad, look at that tug. It's pulling a 737. Several passengers turned at the excitement in his voice, some smiling despite themselves at his obvious enthusiasm. For a moment, the tension seemed to ease slightly. That's a pushback tug, buddy, Connor corrected gently. See how it's pushing the plane away from the gate rather than pulling it? Oh, right. Dylan's face lit up. Like the ones we saw at Andrews that time when you showed me the... Connor's hand touched his son's shoulder gently, a subtle signal. There were some memories, some places that were better left unmentioned in present company. Dylan caught the signal and shifted topics seamlessly. When you showed me the different types of aircraft. But the moment of almost normalcy was shattered by a snort from across the aisle. The man who'd commented earlier was shaking his head with amusement. Andrews Air Force Base, he said to his companion loud enough for half the cabin to hear. The boys probably confusing it with some air show or museum tour. These people love to embellish, make themselves sound more important than they are. Connor felt something cold wash over him, a familiar sensation marked from his military days, when a situation was about to go from manageable to dangerous. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the cabin's quiet. You should be careful about making assumptions. There was something in his tone, a quality that combat veterans recognized, a stillness that spoke of violence held in check, that made several passengers look up from their magazines and phones. The man across the aisle seemed to sense it too, his posture shifting slightly. Excuse me, I said, you should be careful about making assumptions. Connor repeated, his gaze steady and unblinking. About people you don't know, about places you've never been, about things you've never done. The man's face flushed slightly. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I'm sure you don't. The exchange might have escalated, but the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure clearance. The engines spooled up, and Connor felt the familiar sensation of acceleration pressing him back into his seat. As they lifted off, Connor closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember just for a moment what it felt like to be the one in control of that ascent. The feeling of the stick in his hands, the responsive rumble of the engines, the earth falling away beneath him as he climbed toward the infinite blue. Those memories were dangerous territory, filled with both exhilaration and loss. They reminded him of who he'd been before life had stripped away everything that had defined him. His rank, his purpose, his identity as something more than just another struggling single father. Dylan was still pressed against the window, watching the city shrink below them. "Dad, remember when you used to tell me about flying above the clouds?" "I remember. You said it was like being in heaven." Connor's throat tightened. Sometimes it felt that way. Around them, the cabin had settled into the rhythm of a long flight. Passengers were pulling out laptops and tablets, settling in for what would be a cross-country journey. The flight attendants began their service, wheeling carts down the aisles with practiced efficiency. When the beverage cart reached their row, the attendant, the same one who'd questioned their boarding passes, seemed to hesitate slightly. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" she asked, though her tone was notably cooler than what Connor had observed with other passengers. "Orange juice for him, coffee for me, please." She poured Dylan's juice into a plastic cup. Connor noticed that other passengers had received glassware, and handed Connor a coffee in a paper cup that looked suspiciously like it had come from the coach galley. "Will there be anything else?" The question was perfunctory, her attention already shifting to the next row. "Actually, yes," Connor said quietly. "I'm curious about the different service standards you seem to be applying." The flight attendant's smile faltered. "I'm sorry. The glassware. The ceramic cups. I'm wondering if there's a reason we're receiving different service than other first-class passengers." Several nearby passengers had stopped their conversations to listen. The flight attendant's face flushed slightly. These are the standard service items. For coach, perhaps." Connor's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. "I'd appreciate it if you'd treat my son with the same courtesy you'd show any other passenger in this cabin." The request was reasonable, but it carried the weight of something more. Around them, Connor could sense the subtle shift in atmosphere as other passengers began to take notice of what was happening. The flight attendant, clearly flustered, mumbled something about checking on other passengers and hurried away. A few minutes later, she returned with proper glassware and a fresh cup of coffee, her demeanor noticeably more professional. Dylan looked up at his father with admiration. "You stood up for us." "Always," Connor replied simply. "We don't make trouble, but we don't accept being treated as less than we are either." The man across the aisle had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. "So what do you do?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected the answer to justify his earlier judgment. Connor considered the question. How do you explain a life that had once involved classified missions and split-second decisions that could affect national security, but now centered around oil changes and brake repairs? How do you bridge the gap between who you were and who you've become? "I work with my hands," he said finally. "I fix things that are broken." It was true, if incomplete. He did work with his hands now in ways he never had during his Air Force career. Every day at Henderson's auto shop was a reminder of how far his world had contracted, how different his life had become. The man seemed satisfied with this answer, filing Connor away in whatever mental category he reserved for blue-collar workers who'd somehow stumbled into first class. He returned to his newspaper with a dismissive nod. But Dylan was looking at his father with those perceptive eyes again. "Dad, you used to fix different kinds of things, didn't you?" Connor's hand found the envelope in his pocket again, feeling the weight of its contents. Inside were documents that could change everything. Orders for reassignment, a request for his immediate return to active duty, explanations about why his particular skills were suddenly needed again. "Yes," he said softly. "I did." The flight settled into a routine, the initial tension giving way to the mundane reality of air travel. Connor tried to lose himself in a magazine, but his mind kept drifting to the envelope and what it represented. Colonel Martinez had been clear during their brief phone conversation. The Air Force needed him back. There were situations developing that required his specific expertise, missions that only someone with his background could handle. But that was before Sarah's diagnosis, before the desperate fight against cancer that had consumed their savings, their future, and ultimately her life. Before he'd walked away from everything he'd ever known to become the only parent Dylan had left. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was flying to Washington, D.C., not for a Pentagon briefing or a mission assignment, but for a parent-teacher conference at Dylan's school. Their old school, the one Dylan had attended before Connor's world had imploded. The one where he was now enrolled again thanks to Sarah's mother's intervention and her willingness to pay the tuition despite her disapproval of Connor's life choices. Dylan had fallen asleep against his shoulder, and Connor found himself studying his son's face in the filtered light of the cabin. So much of Sarah was there. The shape of his nose, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks, the stubborn cowlick that never would lie flat. But there was something of Connor there too, a determination that showed itself in the set of his jaw even in sleep. "He looks like you." Connor turned to find an elderly woman in the seat beside him, smiling gently. She was different from the other passengers, her clothing expensive but understated, her manner suggesting wealth without the need to flaunt it. "His mother would disagree," Connor replied softly. "Mothers usually do." Her smile was knowing. "I'm Margaret Chen, and you're clearly a good father, whatever anyone else in this cabin might think." The kindness in her voice was unexpected, and Connor felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "Connor Walsh, and thank you. I raised 4 children on my own," Margaret continued, her voice low so as not to wake Dylan. "After my husband died in Vietnam, I know what it looks like when a parent is doing their best against difficult odds." Connor nodded, not trusting himself to speak. It had been a long time since anyone had acknowledged the effort he was putting in, the daily struggle to be enough for Dylan, when sometimes he felt like he was failing at everything. "The judgment of strangers says more about them than about you," Margaret added. "Though I suspect you know that already." She was right, of course. Connor had learned to develop thick skin over the past 3 years, to shield himself from the assumptions and prejudices of people who saw only surface details. But it was harder when Dylan was the target, when his son had to endure the sidelong glances and whispered comments. A sudden jolt of turbulence shook the aircraft, causing several passengers to look up nervously from their devices. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some moderate turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Connor's body responded automatically to the familiar sensation, his military training reading the aircraft's movements with unconscious precision. This wasn't serious turbulence, uncomfortable perhaps, but nothing close to dangerous. He'd flown through much worse in military aircraft that were far less stable than this commercial airliner. But around him, several passengers were clearly nervous. The man who'd been so dismissive earlier was gripping his armrests, his knuckles white. A woman 2 rows up was looking around anxiously, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Another jolt, stronger this time, and someone behind them let out a small cry of alarm. Connor turned to see a young mother holding an infant, her face pale with fear as she struggled to maintain her composure. Without thinking, Connor unbuckled his seatbelt and moved toward her, his movements steady despite the aircraft's motion. The flight attendants were strapped into their jump seats following safety protocols, but Connor's instincts were purely civilian now. See someone in distress, offer help. "Hey," he said softly, crouching beside her seat. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm sorry, I hate flying, and with the baby." "It's just turbulence," Connor said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what was happening. "The pilot's probably just changing altitude to find smoother air. Nothing to worry about." "How can you be so sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. Connor could have told her about the thousands of hours he'd logged in aircraft far less forgiving than this one, about flying through thunderstorms and sandstorms and conditions that would ground civilian flights for days. Instead, he simply said, "Trust me, I know a little about flying." Another jolt, and the baby started to cry. Connor reached out instinctively, his hands gentle as he helped the mother adjust her hold. "Try to stay relaxed," he advised. "Babies pick up on our tension. If you're calm, he'll calm down too." There was something in his manner, a competence and confidence that went beyond mere reassurance, that seemed to ease the woman's panic. Around them, other passengers had noticed the interaction, and Connor was aware of their attention in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable. The turbulence was already beginning to ease the aircraft's motion, smoothing, as the pilot found the calmer air he'd been seeking. Connor started to return to his seat, but found his path blocked by a flight attendant. Not the one who'd been dismissive earlier, but an older man with kind eyes and silver hair. "Sir, you shouldn't be out of your seat during turbulence," the attendant said, but his tone was more concerned than disciplinary. "I know," Connor replied simply. "Someone needed help." The attendant glanced over at the young mother, who was now visibly more relaxed, then back at Connor. There was something in his expression that suggested recognition, though not of Connor personally. "Thank you," the attendant said quietly. "That was above and beyond." Connor shrugged as he returned to his seat, buckling Dylan back in as his son stirred sleepily. Around them, the cabin was returning to normal conversations, resuming as the aircraft settled into smooth flight. But something had shifted. Connor could feel it in the way people were looking at him now, not with the dismissive judgment from before, but with a kind of puzzled respect. The man across the aisle was studying him with new interest, his earlier disdain replaced by curiosity. Margaret Chen was smiling at him with unmistakable approval. "Interesting," she murmured. "You move like someone who's used to taking charge in crisis situations." Connor didn't respond, but he could feel the weight of her observation. It was true. Despite his current circumstances, despite the worn clothes and the daily grind of civilian life, something in him still responded automatically to emergency situations. Some instincts once trained never fully disappeared. Dylan was fully awake now, looking around the cabin with sleepy confusion. "Dad, what happened?" "Just a little bumpy air," Connor replied. "Nothing serious." But Dylan was perceptive beyond his years, and Connor could see him processing the subtle changes in atmosphere around them. The way conversations had quieted slightly, the way several passengers kept glancing in their direction. The remainder of the flight passed without incident, but Connor was increasingly aware of the attention they were drawing. It wasn't the hostile judgment from earlier. This was something different, a kind of puzzled interest that made him almost as uncomfortable as the previous disdain. As they began their descent into Washington, D.C., Connor found himself looking out the window at the familiar landscape below. The Pentagon was visible in the distance, its distinctive shape reminding him of briefings and planning sessions that felt like they'd happened in another lifetime. Andrews Air Force Base lay beyond, where hangars housed aircraft he'd once flown with the casual confidence of someone born to the skies. "Dad, is that where you used to work?" Dylan asked, following his gaze. "Part of it," Connor replied carefully. The truth was more complicated than that. His assignments had taken him all over the world, to bases and installations that didn't appear on civilian maps. But Andrews had been home base for the better part of his career, the place where he'd honed his skills and earned his reputation. The aircraft touched down smoothly, and as they taxied toward the gate, Connor felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that had become associated with any return to Washington. This city held too many memories, too many reminders of the man he'd once been. As passengers began gathering their belongings, the elderly flight attendant approached their row again. "Excuse me, Mr. Walsh." "Mr. Walsh, I wanted to thank you again for your help during the turbulence. It's rare to see that kind of situational awareness from civilian passengers." The comment hung in the air, loaded with implications that Connor chose not to address. Instead, he simply nodded and gathered Dylan's backpack. But as they prepared to disembark, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed during the course of the flight. The envelope in his pocket seemed to pulse with renewed significance, and he found himself wondering if his carefully constructed civilian life was about to collide with the military past he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Dylan slipped his hand into Connor's as they joined the line of departing passengers. "Dad, people are looking at us differently now." Connor squeezed his son's hand gently. "Sometimes people's opinions change when they get to know us better." "Is that good or bad?" Connor considered the question as they stepped off the aircraft and into the terminal. Around them, the familiar sounds and sights of Reagan National brought back a flood of memories. Arriving for classified briefings, departing for missions, he couldn't discuss the constant tension between duty and the growing family responsibilities that had ultimately claimed his loyalty. "I don't know yet, buddy," he said honestly. "I guess we'll find out." But even as he spoke the words, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that their simple flight to Washington had set something in motion, something that would challenge everything he'd built in his new life. The weight of the envelope in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, and he found himself wondering if the past he'd tried so hard to leave behind was finally catching up with him. The terminal buzzed with the controlled chaos of afternoon arrivals, but Connor felt an odd stillness settling over him as they walked through the jet bridge. Dylan's small hand remained firmly clasped in his, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors of Reagan National. The envelope in Connor's jacket seemed to radiate heat against his ribs, a constant reminder of the decision that awaited him. "Dad, look at all the uniforms," Dylan whispered, his voice filled with the same awe it had held during their rare visits to military bases in the past. Connor followed his son's gaze and felt his stomach tighten. The terminal was unusually crowded with military personnel, more than he'd expect for a typical afternoon. Officers in dress blues moved with purposeful strides, their bearing unmistakably military even from a distance. Something was happening, something that required this level of coordination and presence. They made their way toward baggage claim, but their progress was slowed by the crowd that had gathered near the central information desk. Connor could hear fragments of conversation floating over the general terminal noise. Words like emergency deployment and classified briefing that made his pulse quicken involuntarily. "Excuse me, sir?" The voice came from behind them, crisp and professional. Connor turned to find a young airman in service dress, his ribbons indicating recent deployment experience. "Are you Connor Walsh?" The question hit Connor like a physical blow. Dylan looked up at his father with confusion, sensing the sudden shift in tension. "Who's asking?" Connor's voice carried the automatic caution that came from years of security clearances and classified operations. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, sir. I have orders to escort you to a secure location for debriefing." Connor felt the blood drain from his face. I'm not on active duty, Sergeant. You must have me confused with someone else. The airman's expression didn't change. Sir, my orders are quite specific. Mr. Connor Walsh, former Lieutenant Colonel, call sign Midnight Viper. You're requested to report immediately for emergency consultation. The words hung in the air like a detonated bomb. Around them, the normal sounds of the terminal seemed to fade into background noise as Connor's military training kicked in automatically. Emergency consultation. That meant crisis, meant lives at stake, meant the kind of situation where his particular expertise was considered essential. Dylan tugged at his father's hand. Dad, what's a call sign? Connor looked down at his son, seeing confusion and growing concern in those bright blue eyes. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his father had once been someone else entirely? Someone whose reputation still commanded respect and immediate response years after he'd walked away. It's like a nickname, Connor said weakly, aware of how inadequate the explanation was. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was checking his watch, his posture indicating that this wasn't a request open to debate. Sir, I understand you have family obligations, but this is classified as Priority Alpha. Transportation has been arranged for both you and your son to a secure facility. Both of us. Connor's protective instincts flared immediately. Absolutely not. My son has nothing to do with military operations. Sir, with respect, my orders come directly from the Pentagon. Colonel Martinez was very specific that your family's security was to be ensured during the consultation period. The mention of Martinez's name hit Connor like a second wave of recognition. Miguel Martinez had been his squadron commander during his final tour, one of the few people who'd understood why Connor had chosen family over career when Sarah's diagnosis had forced an impossible choice. If Martinez was involved, this wasn't some routine recall. This was something serious enough to override every protocol about retired personnel and family security. Dylan was looking between his father and the sergeant with growing alarm. Dad, are we in trouble? Connor knelt down to his son's eye level, his hands gentle on Dylan's shoulders. No, buddy, we're not in trouble. But sometimes people need help with things I used to be good at. Like fixing planes. The innocent question drew unexpected attention from nearby passengers. Connor became aware that their conversation was attracting curious stares, particularly from the military personnel scattered throughout the terminal. Several officers had paused in their own conversations to watch the interaction, their expressions suggesting recognition, or at least professional interest. Something like that, Connor said softly. He stood and turned back to Rodriguez. Sergeant, I need guarantees about my son's safety and his return to civilian custody regardless of whatever consultation you're requesting. Already arranged, sir. Full family security protocols are in effect. Connor felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. The rational part of his mind screamed that he should walk away, should take Dylan and disappear into the crowd before this situation could pull them deeper into a world he'd deliberately left behind. But another part of him, the part that had earned the call sign Midnight Viper through actions he couldn't discuss and missions that remained classified years later, was already analyzing the situation, assessing threats, and calculating responses. Dad, Dylan's voice was small, uncertain. What does this mean? Connor looked at his son, then at the sergeant, then at the crowd of military personnel who seemed to be waiting for his decision. The envelope in his pocket felt like it was burning against his chest, its contents suddenly taking on new and urgent significance. It means, Connor said carefully, that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried as deeply as we'd like. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez gestured toward a side corridor that Connor recognized as leading to the secured sections of the terminal. Sir, if you'll follow me, transportation is waiting. As they began walking, Connor noticed how their small procession was drawing attention. Military personnel straightened as they passed, their eyes following Connor with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something approaching recognition. Word was spreading through the terminal's military community with the efficiency that Connor remembered from his active duty days. "Dad, why is everyone staring at us now?" Dylan whispered. Connor glanced around, noting the subtle but unmistakable signs of increased attention. Because sometimes names carry weight even when the person carrying them just wants to be left alone. They passed through a security checkpoint that Dylan didn't recognize, but Connor knew led to the classified areas of the airport. The TSA agent barely glanced at their identification before waving them through his deference, suggesting that whatever authorization Rodriguez carried superseded normal civilian protocols. The corridor beyond was sterile and institutional, lined with unmarked doors and subtle security cameras. Connor felt the familiar sensation of entering a world that existed parallel to civilian life, but remained largely invisible to it. It was a feeling he'd hoped never to experience again. "Sergeant," Connor said as they walked, "I need to know what we're walking into. My son's safety is non-negotiable." "Understood, sir. The briefing will cover all relevant details, but I can tell you that your consultation was specifically requested by name. Apparently, there's a situation developing that requires your particular expertise." "My expertise is 5 years out of date." "Sir, with respect, some expertise doesn't expire." They reached a heavy door marked only with a number and a small government seal. Rodriguez swiped a card and gestured them inside. The room beyond was a standard military briefing space. White walls, fluorescent lighting, a large table surrounded by chairs that had seen countless classified discussions. But it wasn't empty. 3 officers were already seated at the table, their uniforms and bearing immediately familiar to Connor, despite the years that had passed. At the head of the table sat Colonel Miguel Martinez, older now, but still carrying the same intensity that had made him one of the Air Force's most respected tactical minds. "Hello, Connor," Martinez said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have much choice," Connor replied, though there was no hostility in his tone. "Miguel, what's this about?" Martinez's gaze shifted to Dylan, who was taking in the room with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child encountering something completely outside his normal experience. "And this must be Dylan. He's grown since the last photos you sent." The casual reference to their continued contact surprised Connor. He'd thought their communication had ended when he'd declined the previous recall attempts, but apparently Martinez had been keeping track of their lives more closely than Connor had realized. "Dylan, why don't you have a seat over here?" Martinez gestured to a chair positioned slightly apart from the main table. "There are some tablets there with games, and we'll try to keep this boring adult stuff as brief as possible." Dylan looked to his father for permission, and Connor nodded reluctantly. As his son settled into the chair with one of the tablets, Connor took his place at the briefing table, noting how naturally he fell into the familiar posture and mindset of a military consultation. "Gentlemen," Martinez began, his tone shifting to full professional mode, "what I'm about to share is classified at the highest levels. Connor, your security clearance has been temporarily reactivated for this briefing." Connor felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Miguel, I walked away from all of this. My clearance lapsed years ago." "Actually, it didn't." Martinez slid a folder across the table. "Your clearance was placed in inactive status at your request, but given the nature of your previous assignments, full revocation was never processed. The review board felt that your expertise might be needed again someday." Connor stared at the folder without opening it. "What kind of situation are we talking about?" One of the other officers, A colonel Connor didn't recognize, leaned forward. "Sir, we're facing a crisis that specifically requires your background in advanced tactical aviation and enemy aircraft analysis. There have been incidents involving unidentified aircraft operating in restricted airspace displaying flight characteristics that don't match any known technology." Unidentified aircraft? Connor's tone was carefully neutral. "You mean UFOs? We mean aircraft of unknown origin and capability that have violated some of our most secure airspace," Martinez replied, "including areas where our most advanced prototype aircraft are being tested. 3 pilots have been lost in the past month attempting to intercept these craft." The words hit Connor like physical blows. 3 pilots lost. Young aviators probably not much older than Dylan, who'd followed intercept protocols that might have been inadequate for whatever they'd encountered. "What makes you think I can help?" Connor asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Martinez opened his own folder and pulled out a series of photographs. "Because 15 years ago you encountered something similar over the Nevada test range. Your after-action report was classified so deeply that only 12 people in the entire military have ever read it. You survived an encounter that should have been fatal, and your tactical analysis led to the development of new intercept protocols that are still in use today." Connor stared at the photographs, his mind automatically analyzing the grainy images of aircraft that seemed to defy conventional understanding of aerodynamics. The shapes were wrong, the flight patterns impossible according to everything he knew about physics and engineering. But they were also hauntingly familiar. "Dad," Dylan's voice cut through the tension. "Are you okay? You look really pale." Connor turned to see his son watching him with concern, the tablet forgotten in his lap. In that moment, the full weight of his dual existence crashed down on him. Here he was reviewing classified materials and discussing aerial phenomena that could reshape understanding of flight itself, while his 8-year-old son sat 3 feet away playing games on a government tablet. "I'm fine, buddy," Connor said, though his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. Martinez was watching the interaction with understanding. "Connor, I know this is difficult. I know you have responsibilities now that go beyond military service. But the truth is, we're out of options. 3 more pilots are scheduled for intercept missions in the next 72 hours, and based on current tactical assessments, they're flying into a situation that could get them killed. And you think my 5-year-old encounter report can save them? I think your survival instincts and tactical innovations saved your life when conventional responses would have failed. I think you see patterns and solutions that other pilots miss. And I think," Martinez paused, glancing at Dylan, "that you understand better than anyone what it means to have people depending on you coming home alive." The words struck home with devastating accuracy. Connor looked at his son, then at the photographs of impossible aircraft, then at the faces of officers who were clearly dealing with a crisis that had no easy solutions. "If I consult on this," Connor said slowly, "what exactly are you asking of me? Analysis of current incident reports, review of tactical approaches, possible modification of intercept protocols." Martinez hesitated. "And if necessary, direct involvement in developing new response strategies." Direct involvement meaning what exactly? Meaning that if we can't solve this from the ground, we might need someone with your specific experience to fly point on the next intercept mission. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Connor felt Dylan's eyes on him, sensed his son's growing understanding that this conversation was about more than just consulting on someone else's problems. "Dad," Dylan said quietly, "are they asking you to fly again?" Connor turned to face his son, seeing in those blue eyes the same fear that had haunted their lives during Sarah's illness. The fear of losing the only parent he had left. But there was something else there too, something that might have been understanding, or even pride. "They're asking me to help," Connor said carefully. "But that doesn't mean I have to say yes." Dylan was quiet for a long moment, his young mind clearly working through implications that most adults would struggle to process. Finally, he spoke with a maturity that always surprised Connor. "Mom used to say that sometimes we have to do scary things to help people." The words hit Connor like a physical blow. Sarah had said exactly that during her final weeks, when she'd been trying to prepare Dylan for the reality that sometimes people made sacrifices for others. Sometimes love meant taking risks that felt impossible. Martinez was watching the exchange with obvious respect for the 8-year-old's insight. "Dylan, your father was one of the best pilots the Air Force has ever produced. If he decides to help us, it would be because people's lives depend on it." "Like a superhero?" Dylan asked. "Like a hero," Martinez corrected gently. "The real kind who get scared but do the right thing anyway." Connor felt the weight of expectation from multiple directions. The military's need for his expertise, his son's faith in his ability to help others, and his own internal struggle between the life he'd built and the calling he'd never completely abandoned. "I need details," Connor said finally. "Everything you can tell me about these incidents, the aircraft involved, the pilots who were lost. I need to understand what we're really dealing with before I make any commitments." Martinez nodded and began pulling additional files from his briefcase. The first incident occurred 3 weeks ago over Groom Lake. Captain Jennifer Hayes was conducting a routine test flight when radar picked up an unidentified contact, moving at impossible speeds. As Martinez began laying out photographs and technical readouts, Connor felt his mind shifting into analytical mode automatically. The images showed aircraft that seemed to ignore basic principles of lift and thrust, moving in patterns that should have generated G-forces fatal to any human pilot. The contact approached Captain Hayes's aircraft at approximately Mach 3, then matched her speed instantaneously. Martinez continued. "No visible means of propulsion, no heat signature consistent with any known engine technology." Connor studied the radar tracks, his trained eye immediately identifying the impossibilities. These acceleration patterns would liquefy a human pilot. We're talking about instantaneous velocity changes that generate hundreds of Gs. Exactly. Captain Hayes reported that the contact seemed to be studying her aircraft, maintaining formation for approximately 40 seconds before disappearing. Disappearing how? According to her report, it simply wasn't there anymore. No dramatic acceleration, no visible departure. One moment, it was flying alongside her F-22, the next moment, empty sky. Connor felt a chill of recognition. The description matched elements of his own classified encounter years earlier, details that had been buried so deeply that he'd sometimes wondered if he'd imagined the entire incident. Dylan had left his chair and moved closer to the table, his curiosity overcoming the unfamiliarity of the military environment. "Dad, are those pictures of alien spaceships?" The question drew surprised looks from the officers, but Connor found himself considering it seriously. "What do you think, buddy? What do you see in these pictures?" Dylan studied the images with the unbiased perception that adults often lost. "They look like they're flying wrong, like they don't follow the same rules as regular airplanes." "That's a very good observation," Martinez said, his tone respectful rather than condescending. "That's exactly what our best analysts have concluded." Connor continued reviewing the files, each incident report adding to a picture that defied conventional understanding. The second pilot had been lost when his aircraft simply disappeared from radar during an intercept attempt. No wreckage had been recovered, no distress signal received. The third incident had involved a near collision that had left the pilot alive but psychologically traumatized, reporting experiences that didn't match any known phenomena. Miguel, Connor said finally. These aren't just unidentified aircraft. These are intelligently controlled craft that seem to be deliberately interacting with our pilots. The patterns suggest reconnaissance, possibly testing our response capabilities. That's our assessment as well, which brings us to the immediate crisis. Martinez pulled out a final set of documents. 3 F-22s are scheduled for intercept missions beginning tomorrow morning. Based on current protocols, they're flying into situations that may be beyond their technical and tactical capabilities. Connor looked up from the files, understanding the full scope of what was being asked of him. You want me to redesign intercept protocols in less than 24 hours? We want you to give those pilots the best possible chance of coming home alive. And if ground-based analysis isn't sufficient, Martinez met his gaze steadily, then we need someone with your experience to fly with them. The request hung between them like a bridge spanning two different worlds. The civilian life Connor had built with Dylan and the military calling that had once defined him completely. He could feel his son watching him, could sense the boy's understanding that this moment would determine their future in ways that couldn't be undone. Connor stood and walked to the room's single window, looking out at the afternoon sky where commercial aircraft traced their orderly paths between airports. Somewhere out there beyond the controlled airspace and regulated flight corridors, aircraft of unknown origin were operating according to rules that challenged everything he thought he understood about flight. "Dad." Dylan's voice was soft, uncertain. "What are you thinking about?" Connor turned back to face the room, seeing his son's worried expression and the expectant faces of officers who were asking him to risk everything he'd rebuilt for the sake of people he'd never met. "I'm thinking," Connor said slowly, "about what your mother would tell me to do." The words seemed to settle over the room like a benediction. Martinez nodded slightly, understanding the weight of invoking Sarah's memory in this context. The other officers maintained respectful silence, recognizing that they were witnessing a decision that went beyond military consultation. Dylan walked over to his father, slipping his small hand into Connor's larger one. "She'd tell you to help people if you could, wouldn't she?" Connor squeezed his son's hand gently, feeling the full weight of the moment pressing down on them both. "Yeah, buddy. She would." The decision crystallized in that instant, not as a choice between competing loyalties, but as an acceptance of who he'd always been beneath the civilian facade he'd constructed. Midnight Viper had never really disappeared. He'd just been waiting for a situation serious enough to justify the risks involved. "All right, Miguel," Connor said, his voice carrying new resolve. "Let's figure out how to keep your pilots alive." The words had barely left Connor's mouth when the briefing room's secure phone rang, with the sharp, insistent tone that every military officer recognized as urgent. Martinez answered on the second ring, his expression growing increasingly grim as he listened to the voice on the other end. "When?" Martinez asked, his tone clipped. "How many?" A pause. "Understood. We'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and turned to face the room, his expression grave. "Gentlemen, the timeline just accelerated. We have an active situation developing over restricted area 4800N. 2 F-22s scrambled 15 minutes ago to intercept an unidentified contact. Radio contact was lost with both aircraft 3 minutes ago." The words hit Connor like a physical blow. 2 more pilots, possibly down, possibly facing whatever had claimed the others. Dylan's hand tightened in his, and Connor could feel his son's tension, even without looking at him. "Miguel, please tell me you have search and rescue in the air," Connor said, his mind already shifting into emergency response mode. "SAR is launching now, but—" Martinez hesitated, glancing at Dylan. "Connor, the radar signatures we're seeing don't match anything in our threat assessment protocols. Whatever's out there, It's unlike anything we've encountered before. Colonel Peterson, one of the other officers who'd remained silent during the initial briefing, leaned forward. Sir, with your permission, I'd like to brief Mr. Walsh on the specific technical parameters we're dealing with. Martinez nodded, and Peterson began laying out a series of real-time radar displays on the table's built-in monitors. The images showed ghostly contacts moving in patterns that defied physics as Connor understood it. These contacts are demonstrating flight characteristics that our best analysis suggests are impossible, Peterson explained. Instantaneous acceleration, right-angle turns at supersonic speeds, complete stops from Mach 2 in zero distance. Connor studied the displays, his trained eye immediately recognizing the tactical implications. If these performance parameters are accurate, our pilots aren't just outmatched. They're completely outclassed. It's like sending cavalry against jet fighters. Dad, Dylan said quietly, tugging at Connor's sleeve. Are those pilots in trouble? Connor looked down at his son, seeing worry and confusion in those bright blue eyes. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that people are in mortal danger from something that shouldn't exist according to everything humanity understands about flight? Yes, buddy, they might be. Can you help them? The simple question cut through all the technical analysis and strategic considerations. 2 pilots were missing, possibly dead, and more were scheduled to face the same unknown threat. Connor felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the burden that had once driven him to push the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation. Martinez was watching the exchange with obvious understanding. Connor, I know this isn't what you signed up for when you walked off that plane today, but we're looking at a situation that could escalate beyond our ability to control it. What do you mean escalate? These contacts aren't just violating our airspace randomly. They're appearing near our most sensitive facilities, test sites, weapons development centers, strategic installations. The pattern suggests deliberate intelligence gathering. Connor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. You think they're mapping our defenses? We think they're probing for weaknesses, and every time we send aircraft to intercept, we're essentially showing them our capabilities while they demonstrate superiority that makes our best technology look primitive. The implications were staggering. If an unknown force was systematically evaluating American air defenses and finding them inadequate, the national security ramifications went far beyond lost pilots or damaged aircraft. Dylan had been listening to the conversation with the intense focus that children sometimes brought to adult discussions they sensed were important. Dad, if our planes can't catch the bad guys, what happens? Connor knelt down to his son's eye level, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, buddy, when regular solutions don't work, you need someone who thinks differently about the problem. Like you. The trust in Dylan's voice was both humbling and terrifying. Connor had spent 3 years building a life where his military past was safely buried, where his son could grow up without the constant uncertainty that came with having a parent whose job involved mortal risk, now that carefully constructed normalcy was crumbling around them. Maybe like me, Connor admitted. Martinez cleared his throat gently. Connor, I need to be direct about what we're asking. Our standard intercept protocols are not only ineffective, they're getting our people killed. We need new tactical approaches, and we need them implemented immediately. And you think my 15-year-old encounter gives me some kind of special insight. I think your survival instincts and tactical innovation kept you alive when conventional responses would have failed. More importantly, I think you understand these phenomena in ways that our current pilots don't. Connor stood and walked back to the radar displays, studying the impossible flight patterns with growing recognition. Elements of what he was seeing matched his own classified encounter. But there were new behaviors, new capabilities that suggested evolution or adaptation. Miguel, I need to see the full tactical breakdown of today's incident. Flight plans, communications, transcripts, everything. It's being compiled now, but Connor... Martinez paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. There's something else. The contacts weren't just observed by our pilots. Ground stations recorded the entire encounter, including what happened to our aircraft. Meaning we have visual confirmation of interactions that go beyond simple aerial maneuvering. Peterson activated another display, this one showing gun camera footage that made Connor's blood run cold. The images were grainy but unmistakable. 2 F-22 Raptors in formation, approaching a contact that appeared as little more than a shifting distortion in the air. Then, without any visible cause, both aircraft simply stopped. Not crashed, not destroyed, but frozen in mid-flight, as if suspended by invisible forces. The footage showed them hanging motionless in the sky for nearly 30 seconds before disappearing entirely, leaving no trace of wreckage or debris. Dylan had climbed onto a chair to see the display better, his young face pale with shock. "Dad, what happened to those planes?" Connor stared at the footage, his mind racing through possibilities that challenged every assumption he'd held about physics and technology. "I don't know, buddy. Something we don't understand yet." But even as he spoke, fragments of memory from his own encounter began surfacing. Moments during that classified mission, when his aircraft had behaved in ways that defied explanation, when he'd felt forces acting on his plane that had no technological source. "Connor," Martinez said quietly, "we've lost 6 pilots in 3 weeks. The Pentagon is considering grounding all intercept operations, which means we'd essentially be ceding our airspace to whatever these things are. Or we could send up someone who's encountered this before and survived," Peterson added. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Connor looked at the frozen image of the disappeared F-22s, then at his son's worried face, then at the officers who were clearly dealing with a crisis beyond their experience or training. "If I agreed to this," Connor said slowly, "what exactly would be the mission parameters?" Martinez exchanged glances with Peterson before responding. "Single aircraft reconnaissance, advanced sensors and recording equipment to gather intelligence on contact behavior. Strict orders to avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary for survival. Single aircraft meaning solo flight. Meaning maximum maneuverability and minimum risk to personnel." Connor understood the implications. A solo mission meant no wingman for support, no backup if things went wrong. It also meant that only one pilot would be at risk instead of 2, and that the aircraft would have maximum flexibility to respond to unexpected situations. Dylan had been following the conversation with growing alarm. "Dad, they want you to fly toward the things that made those other planes disappear." The question was asked with the devastating clarity that children brought to adult complications. Connor looked at his son, seeing fear and confusion, but also something that might have been pride or understanding. "That's what they're asking, yes." "Is it dangerous?" Connor could have lied, could have minimized the risks to spare his son's feelings. But Dylan had already seen too much, understood too much about the gravity of the situation. "Yes, it's dangerous." Dylan was quiet for a long moment, his young mind clearly working through implications that most adults would struggle to process. When he spoke again, his voice was small but steady. "But if you don't go, more pilots might get hurt." "That's possible. And you're the only one who's seen these things before and didn't get hurt." Connor felt his throat tighten. "As far as we know, yes." Dylan looked at the frozen image on the display, then back at his father. "Mom always said that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." The words hit Connor like a physical blow. Sarah had said exactly that during her final weeks, when she'd been preparing Dylan for a world where sometimes people had to make impossible choices for the sake of others. Martinez was watching the exchange with obvious respect for the 8-year-old's maturity. Dylan, your father would be flying the most advanced aircraft we have, with the best safety equipment and support systems available. But he might not come back, Dylan said simply. The statement hung in the air like a verdict. Connor felt the weight of his son's understanding, the terrible clarity of a child who'd already lost one parent and understood that loss was always possible. That's true, Connor said honestly. I might not come back. But if you don't go, other dads might not come back to their kids either. The observation was delivered with devastating accuracy. Connor looked around the room, seeing officers who were themselves fathers, husbands, sons. The pilots who'd been lost had families, people who were waiting for news that might never come. Connor, Martinez said gently, whatever you decide, we'll understand. You've already sacrificed enough for your country. But even as Martinez spoke the words, another phone in the room began ringing. Peterson answered quickly, his expression growing increasingly grave as he listened. Understood, Peterson said finally. We'll advise. He hung up and turned to face the room. Gentlemen, we have a new development. Radar stations are tracking multiple contacts approaching from the west. Current count is 7 unidentified aircraft moving in formation at approximately Mach 1.5. The implications were immediate and terrifying. Not a single reconnaissance contact, but multiple aircraft operating in coordinated patterns. Whatever intelligence was behind these incursions was escalating their operations. ETA to restricted airspace, Martinez asked. 47 minutes. Connor felt his military training taking over automatically, his mind shifting into tactical analysis mode. Miguel formation flight suggests command and control capabilities. We're not dealing with random contacts anymore. This is organized activity. Which means our response needs to be immediate and decisive, Martinez replied. Connor, I hate to pressure you, but we're out of time for extended deliberation. Dylan had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding of the urgency. Dad, how long would you be gone? Connor looked at his son, then at the tactical displays showing incoming contacts, then at the officers who were clearly dealing with a crisis that had just escalated beyond all previous parameters. The mission would be approximately 4 hours, Connor said. Take off, intercept reconnaissance, and return. And then you'd come home. If everything goes according to plan, yes. Dylan was quiet for another long moment, his young face serious with the weight of decisions that shouldn't fall on 8-year-old shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice was steady despite the tears Connor could see gathering in his eyes. I think you should go, Dad. The words hit Connor harder than any military order or patriotic appeal could have. His son, who'd already lost his mother and lived every day with the fear of losing his remaining parent, was giving him permission to risk everything for strangers. Dylan, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Dylan interrupted, his voice growing stronger. Mom taught me that sometimes we have to be brave for other people. And you're the bravest person I know. Connor knelt down and pulled his son into a fierce embrace, feeling the small body trembling despite the brave words. Over Dylan's shoulder, he could see Martinez and the other officers maintaining respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a military consultation. All right, Connor said finally, his voice thick with emotion. All right. He stood and turned to face Martinez, feeling something shift inside him as he made the transition from concerned civilian to operational military asset. Miguel, I'll need complete technical specifications on current aircraft capabilities, full briefings on all previous encounters, and access to our most advanced reconnaissance platform. The F-22 that's been modified for the intelligence-gathering mission is fueled and ready at Andrews, Martinez replied. Full sensor suite, advanced recording equipment, enhanced maneuverability systems. And my son's security during the mission. Dylan will remain here under full protection. This facility is completely secure, and he'll have access to communication with the aircraft throughout the flight. Connor looked at Dylan, seeing fear and pride warring in his son's expression. You'll be able to talk to me while I'm flying, buddy. Just like when I used to call you from work trips. Will you tell me what you see up there? The request was so innocent, so trusting, that Connor felt his resolve waver for a moment. How do you explain to a child that you're flying into a situation that might redefine humanity's understanding of what's possible? I'll tell you everything I can, Connor promised. Martinez was already moving toward the door. Connor, we need to get you to Andrews immediately. The contacts will be in restricted airspace in less than 40 minutes. As they gathered the briefing materials and prepared to leave, Dylan tugged at Connor's sleeve one more time. Dad, when you see the alien ships, will you try to talk to them? The question stopped Connor cold. In all the tactical planning and threat assessment, he hadn't considered the possibility that these contacts might be attempting communication rather than simply conducting reconnaissance. What makes you think they want to talk? Connor asked. Because if they wanted to hurt us, they probably could have already. But they keep coming back like they're trying to tell us something. The observation was delivered with the unbiased logic that children often brought to complex situations. Connor looked at Martinez, seeing surprise and consideration in the colonel's expression. That's actually a very insightful analysis, Martinez said. Our behavioral specialists have noted that the contacts seem to be avoiding direct confrontation despite having apparent technological superiority. Connor felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to shift in his mind. Dylan, what else do you think they might be trying to tell us? Maybe that they're not bad guys, Dylan said simply. Maybe they're just different, and people are scared because they don't understand. The words resonated with something deep in Connor's memory, fragments from his own encounter that he'd never fully processed or understood. The realization that this mission might be about more than just military reconnaissance, that it might be about first contact with an intelligence that operated according to completely different rules. All right, buddy, Connor said, his voice filled with new determination. Maybe it's time someone tried to understand. As they left the briefing room and headed toward the vehicles that would take them to Andrews Air Force Base, Connor felt the weight of transformation settling over him. He was no longer just a single father trying to protect his son from a dangerous world. He was Midnight Viper again, preparing to fly into the unknown, with the hope of preventing a conflict that could reshape everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. Dylan walked beside him, his small hand firmly clasped in Connor's larger one, both of them moving toward a future that neither could fully comprehend, but both were brave enough to face together. Behind them, the secure phone in the briefing room rang again with news of additional contacts appearing on radar screens across the country, evidence that whatever was happening was far larger than anyone had initially realized. The drive to Andrews Air Force Base passed in a blur of security checkpoints and classified briefings delivered through encrypted communication systems. Dylan sat quietly beside Connor in the back of the military vehicle, occasionally asking questions about the aircraft they passed or the procedures they observed. Each question reminded Connor of how much his son understood about the military world, how much he'd absorbed during their brief visits to bases and air shows during happier times. As they approached the main gate of Andrews, Connor could see increased activity levels that indicated a base on high alert. Aircraft were being moved into protected hangars. Personnel were operating with the crisp efficiency that came with emergency protocols, and the general atmosphere suggested an organization preparing for potential conflict. "Dad, look at all the planes," Dylan said, his voice filled with the same awe that had marked his reaction to military aircraft since he was old enough to point at the sky. Connor followed his son's gaze, noting the mix of transport aircraft, fighter jets, and specialized platforms that represented some of the Air Force's most advanced capabilities. Somewhere among those aircraft was the modified F-22 that would carry him into an encounter with the unknown. The vehicle stopped at a secured hangar that Connor recognized as being reserved for the most sensitive operations. As they climbed out, Martinez appeared at Connor's side, his expression grave with new developments. "Connor, the situation has evolved again. We now have confirmation of contacts over multiple states, all moving in coordinated patterns toward high-value targets." "How many total contacts?" "Current count is 23, possibly more. They're operating in groups of 3 to 7 aircraft, maintaining formation integrity that suggests sophisticated command and control." Connor felt the tactical implications settling into his consciousness, like pieces of a complex puzzle. "Miguel, this isn't reconnaissance anymore. This is a demonstration of capability." "That's our assessment as well, which means your mission has taken on even greater significance." They entered the hangar, and Connor felt his breath catch at the sight of the aircraft waiting for him. The F-22 Raptor had been extensively modified with additional sensor arrays and communication equipment, its sleek lines enhanced rather than compromised by the technological additions. It was a machine built for the intersection of art and lethality, engineering and courage. Dylan stopped walking, his young eyes wide with amazement. "Dad, is that what you're going to fly?" "That's her," Connor confirmed, feeling the familiar stirring of excitement that came with seeing a truly exceptional aircraft. A woman in a flight suit approached them, her bearing immediately identifying her as a test pilot. "Colonel Walsh, I'm Major Patricia Santos, your crew chief for this mission. I'll be handling all pre-flight systems checks and mission support." Connor noted the use of his former rank, a courtesy that acknowledged his temporary return to active status. "Major Santos, what's the current status of the aircraft systems?" "All systems nominal, sir. We've installed enhanced radar and optical sensors, advanced communication arrays, and specialized recording equipment. The aircraft is capable of data collection far beyond standard F-22 parameters." As Santos began walking them around the aircraft, pointing out the various modifications and enhancements, Connor found himself slipping back into the familiar rhythm of pre-flight preparation. Dylan stayed close to his side, asking occasional questions that demonstrated his understanding of basic aircraft systems. "The mission profile calls for single aircraft reconnaissance at Angels 25. Santos continued. "You'll have real-time communication with command and control, plus a direct link that will allow your son to monitor mission progress." Connor looked at Dylan, seeing excitement mixed with worry in his expression. "You'll be able to hear everything that happens up there, buddy. Just like having a front row seat." "Will I be able to talk to you?" "Whenever it's safe to do so." Martinez approached with a tablet containing the final mission briefing. "Connor, the contacts are now 40 minutes out from restricted airspace. We need to get you airborne in the next 15 minutes to reach intercept position." Connor took the tablet and quickly reviewed the tactical situation. The incoming contacts were maintaining their formation and speed, showing no signs of evasive action or hostile intent. But their apparent destination was a network of sensitive installations that represented critical national security assets. "Miguel, has anyone attempted radio communication with these contacts?" "Standard hailing on all frequencies, no response." Connor considered this information, remembering Dylan's observation about the contacts possibly trying to communicate in ways that humans didn't recognize. What about non-standard communication attempts? What do you mean? Light signals formation changes any kind of pattern that might indicate attempt at contact. Martinez and Santos exchanged glances. That's not something we've explored extensively. Connor felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. Maybe it's time we started thinking about this as a potential first contact situation rather than a military threat. The suggestion sent a ripple of consideration through the assembled personnel. The possibility that these contacts represented non-human intelligence trying to establish communication would fundamentally change every aspect of the response protocol. Dylan tugged at Connor's flight suit. "Dad, remember what I said about them maybe not being bad guys?" "I remember, buddy. Maybe you could try to be friendly first before you do the military stuff." The advice delivered with 8-year-old directness struck Connor as potentially more valuable than hours of strategic planning. What if the key to this situation wasn't superior tactics or advanced technology, but simply approaching the encounter with openness rather than hostility? "All right," Connor said, his decision crystallizing. "Miguel, I want the mission parameters modified. Primary objective becomes communication attempt with intelligence gathering as secondary priority." "Connor, that's a significant departure from standard protocols." "Standard protocols haven't worked. Maybe it's time to try something different." Santos was nodding with understanding. "Sir, the aircraft's communication systems are more than capable of attempting multiple contact methods. We could even modify the sensor arrays to transmit as well as receive." As the final preparations continued, Connor found himself thinking about the gravity of what he was about to attempt. If Dylan was right, if these contacts represented an intelligence trying to establish peaceful communication, then this mission could determine whether humanity's first contact with non-human technology led to understanding or conflict. Dylan was standing quietly beside the aircraft, his small hand resting on the landing gear strut. When Connor approached, his son looked up with serious eyes. "Dad, I want to tell you something before you go." "What is it, buddy?" "I'm proud of you. Not because you're brave, but because you're trying to help." The words hit Connor with devastating emotional force. He knelt down and pulled his son into a fierce embrace, feeling the weight of responsibility and love that had driven every important decision of his adult life. "I love you, Dylan. No matter what happens up there, remember that." "I love you too, Dad. Come home safe." As Connor suited up for the flight, strapping on equipment that felt both familiar and foreign, after years of civilian life, he found himself thinking about Sarah and what she would have said about this moment. She would have been terrified for his safety, but she also would have understood why he had to go. She would have been proud of Dylan's courage and wisdom, and she would have trusted Connor to make the right decisions when the moment came. The engines spooled up with the distinctive whine of advanced turbofan technology, and Connor felt the familiar thrill of commanding one of humanity's most sophisticated aircraft. As he completed the final systems checks and received clearance for takeoff, he looked through the canopy at Dylan, who was standing with Martinez and Santos, watching with a mixture of fear and pride. "Control, this is Midnight Viper." Connor spoke into his radio, using his call sign for the first time in 5 years. "Ready for departure. Midnight Viper, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed." As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the afternoon sky, Connor felt the weight of transformation complete itself. He was no longer Connor Walsh, auto mechanic and single father. He was Midnight Viper, again pilot and protector, flying toward an encounter that could change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. Below him, Dylan's voice came through the communication system clear and strong despite the distance. "Dad, I can see you." You look like a shooting star. Connor smiled as he climbed toward the approaching contacts, carrying with him his son's courage, his wife's memory, and the hope that sometimes the most important missions were about building bridges rather than walls. The F-22 climbed through 20,000 feet, and Connor felt the familiar sensation of his body settling into the rhythm of high-performance flight. The aircraft responded to his touch like a living thing, every input translated into precise movements through the thin air. Below him, the patchwork of Virginia countryside gave way to the broader expanse of restricted airspace where the encounter would take place. "Midnight Viper, this is Control." Martinez's voice crackled through the secure communication channel. "Current contacts bearing 270, range 40 nautical miles. Altitude appears to be flight level 250, maintaining formation integrity." Connor adjusted his heading and began a gentle climb toward the intercept point. "Control, Midnight Viper copies. Sensor arrays coming online now." The displays in his cockpit lit up with information that went far beyond standard F-22 capabilities. Advanced radar painted a picture of the approaching contacts that defied easy categorization. The signature returns were unlike anything in his extensive database of known aircraft types. "Dad, can you see them yet?" Dylan's voice came through the family communication channel that Santos had established. "Not visually, buddy, but the radar is picking them up. They're still pretty far away." "What do they look like on the radar?" Connor studied the ghostly signatures on his display. "Like nothing I've ever seen before. They don't look like regular airplanes." The contacts were maintaining perfect formation spacing, while moving at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. No evasive maneuvers, no apparent awareness of his approach. Either they were supremely confident in their capabilities, or they wanted to be intercepted. "Control, Midnight Viper," Connor transmitted. "The contacts don't appear to be taking any defensive action. They're maintaining course and speed as if they're unaware of my approach." "Copy that, Midnight Viper. How do you want to proceed?" Connor thought about Dylan's advice to try being friendly first. Standard intercept protocol called for approaching from behind and below, maintaining visual contact while demonstrating superior position. But what if these contacts interpreted such positioning as hostile control? "I'm going to attempt a non-threatening approach, coming up to their altitude and positioning myself off their starboard wing. If they want to establish communication, that gives them the best opportunity." "Midnight Viper, that's not standard protocol." "Standard protocol got 6 pilots killed," Connor replied. "Sometimes you have to improvise." As he climbed through 24,000 feet, Connor began to make out visual contacts against the afternoon sky. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The objects were there, definitely real and definitely flying, but they violated every principle of aerodynamics he'd learned in 20 years of military aviation. They appeared to be roughly triangular, but their edges seemed to shift and blur, as if the very air around them was being distorted. No visible propulsion systems, no wings or control surfaces that would explain their ability to maintain stable flight. They moved through the sky with the fluid grace of creatures that belonged in an entirely different medium. "Control, Midnight Viper has visual contact." Connor reported, his voice tight with amazement. "I'm looking at 7 contacts in loose formation. They appear to be... This is going to sound impossible, but they appear to be defying conventional physics." "Can you describe what you're seeing?" Connor struggled to find words for something that challenged his understanding of reality. "They're triangular, approximately 60 feet on each side, but their edges are indistinct. No visible propulsion, no control surfaces. They're maintaining formation without any apparent effort or coordination signals." "Dad, that sounds amazing." Dylan's voice cut through the military channel. "Are they pretty?" The innocent question made Connor look at the objects with fresh eyes. Pretty wasn't a word he'd normally apply to aircraft, but there was something undeniably graceful about the way these craft moved through the sky. They seemed to belong there in a way that human aircraft never quite achieved. Yeah, buddy, they are pretty. Like watching birds that know exactly where they're going. Connor was now within 2 miles of the formation, close enough to see details that made his military training scream warnings about unknown capabilities. The craft weren't just flying. They were dancing through the air with movements that should have been impossible at their apparent speed and altitude. "Control, I'm going to attempt communication," Connor announced. "Standard hailing frequencies first, then I'll try some nonverbal signals. Midnight Viper, be advised that all previous communication attempts have been unsuccessful." "Understood, but maybe they were using the wrong approach." Connor switched to the international emergency frequency and began transmitting. "Unknown aircraft. This is United States Air Force Flight Midnight Viper. Please respond if you can understand this transmission." Silence filled the radio spectrum, but Connor noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The lead craft in the formation had shifted slightly, turning to present what might have been its forward aspect toward his aircraft. It was a subtle movement, but it suggested awareness and possibly interest. "Unknown aircraft, if you can understand this transmission but cannot respond, please acknowledge by changing your formation." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, the 7 craft shifted into a perfect diamond pattern. The precision was absolute, the timing synchronized to the microsecond. Connor felt his heart racing. "Control, did you see that?" "Affirmative, Midnight Viper. They just demonstrated clear acknowledgement of your communication." "Dad, what happened?" Dylan's voice was filled with excitement. "They answered, buddy. They heard me and they answered." The implications were staggering. Not only was he in contact with craft that operated beyond human technological capabilities, but their operators were intelligent enough to understand his request and respond appropriately. This wasn't just first contact. This was successful first communication. "Control, Midnight Viper requesting permission to attempt closer approach. I want to see if they'll allow me to join their formation." "Midnight Viper, that's extremely dangerous. We have no idea of their intentions or capabilities. We know they're intelligent and they're capable of communication. That's more than we knew an hour ago." Connor didn't wait for permission. He eased his aircraft toward the formation, moving slowly and deliberately to signal peaceful intent. As he approached, the craft adjusted their positions to create a space for him, a gap in their diamond pattern that was exactly the right size for an F-22. "Control, they're making room for me," Connor reported, his voice filled with wonder. "They want me to join their formation." "Midnight Viper, this is highly irregular. We strongly advise against—" "Dad, are you flying with the alien ships?" Dylan's voice cut through the military protests. Connor looked around at the craft that now surrounded him, their impossible grace making his advanced fighter seem clumsy by comparison. "I think I am, buddy." As he settled into formation with the 7 craft, Connor felt a sensation he'd never experienced in 20 years of flying. It was as if his aircraft was being gently guided by invisible forces, his controls responding with a smoothness and precision that went beyond mechanical engineering. The other craft weren't just flying alongside him. They were somehow helping him maintain perfect formation. "This is incredible," Connor breathed. "Control, I'm experiencing some kind of flight assistance. It's like they're sharing their flight characteristics with my aircraft." "What do you mean?" "I mean my plane is performing better than it ever has. Smoother, more responsive, like they're compensating for the limitations of human technology." The formation began a gentle turn toward the south, and Connor found his aircraft responding automatically to maintain position. It wasn't autopilot. He was still in full control, but it was as if the very air around him had become more cooperative. Control, the formation is changing course. New heading 180, maintaining altitude. Midnight Viper, where are they taking you? Connor checked his navigation displays and felt a chill of recognition. They're heading toward Washington, D.C. The implications hit him like a physical blow. These craft weren't just demonstrating their capabilities to him. They were conducting him toward the nation's capital, toward the centers of political and military power. This was either an incredibly sophisticated diplomatic overture or a prelude to something far more serious. "Dad, are you okay?" Dylan's voice carried new worry. "You sound scared." Connor forced himself to remain calm. "I'm fine, buddy. But I think our new friends want to show us something important." As the formation continued its southern course, Connor found himself thinking about the magnitude of what was happening. He was flying in formation, with craft that represented technology centuries beyond human capabilities, possibly serving as humanity's first ambassador to an intelligence that could reshape civilization itself. "Control, I need to know the current status of all military aircraft in the D.C. area." "Midnight Viper, we have multiple fighters on standby at Andrews and other facilities. Current orders are to maintain defensive posture unless you indicate hostile ISIL action. Make sure those orders are clear. If someone gets trigger-happy and starts shooting, this could turn into a disaster." Connor was acutely aware that he was flying in the most politically sensitive airspace in the world, surrounded by craft that could probably destroy every military installation on the East Coast if they chose to do so. The responsibility of preventing an interstellar incident was weighing heavily on his shoulders. The formation passed over the outer suburbs of Washington, and Connor could see the familiar landmarks of his childhood spreading out below. The Washington Monument, the Capitol Building, the Pentagon, symbols of American power that suddenly seemed incredibly fragile in the context of what surrounded him. "Unknown aircraft," Connor transmitted. "If you're trying to demonstrate something to my government, you've definitely got their attention. What is it you want us to understand?" The response came not through radio communication, but through something far more direct and startling. Connor felt a presence in his mind, not invasive or threatening, but unmistakably there. Images began forming in his consciousness, not his own memories, but scenes that seemed to come from outside his own experience. He saw Earth from space, beautiful and blue and heartbreakingly fragile. He saw the craft that surrounded him, but not as isolated vessels, as part of a vast network of similar craft that existed throughout the galaxy. He saw civilizations that had faced the same crossroads, that humanity now approached, some choosing cooperation and growth, others choosing isolation and stagnation. "Control," Connor said slowly, his voice filled with wonder. "I'm receiving some kind of communication that isn't coming through normal channels. They're showing me things." "What kind of things?" "Images, concepts. I think they're trying to explain who they are and why they're here." The mental contact continued, and Connor began to understand the message with growing clarity. These beings weren't invaders or conquerors. They were observers, representatives of a community of civilizations that monitored younger species as they developed spacefaring capabilities. Humanity had reached a critical point where it could either join this larger community or face the challenges of cosmic isolation. "Dad, what are they telling you?" Dylan's voice seemed to anchor Connor to his human identity, even as his mind expanded to encompass concepts that stretched his understanding. "They're telling me that we're not alone, buddy. And they're asking if we want to be part of something bigger than just Earth." The formation began to slow, and Connor realized they were approaching a hover over the National Mall. Below them he could see crowds gathering as people pointed upward at the impossible sight of advanced aircraft hanging motionless in the sky above America's most symbolic spaces. "Control, we're holding position over the mall. I think they want to make sure this moment is witnessed and recorded." "Midnight Viper, we have reports of crowds gathering throughout the city. Social media is going crazy with photos and videos." Connor understood the significance. This wasn't just first contact between military forces. This was first contact with humanity as a whole, conducted in the most public and undeniable way possible. The mental communication continued, and Connor began to receive more specific information about what these beings were offering. Technology that could solve energy crises, medical knowledge that could eliminate diseases, understanding of physics that could open the stars to human exploration. But all of it came with requirements. Humanity would need to demonstrate that it could move beyond its violent tendencies and work cooperatively with other species. "They're offering us a choice," Connor transmitted to Control. "Join a galactic community and gain access to technologies and knowledge beyond our current understanding, or continue on our current path alone." What do they want from us in return? Proof that we can evolve beyond our current limitations. They want to see us become a species worthy of cosmic citizenship. The implications were staggering. Everything humanity had worked toward, every scientific achievement and technological advancement, was being offered as a gift from beings who had mastered these challenges long ago. But the price was fundamental change in how humans related to each other and to the universe. Dylan's voice came through the communication channel with 8-year-old directness. "Dad, do you think we should trust them?" Connor looked around at the craft that surrounded him, feeling the gentle presence of minds that operated on scales of time and space that dwarfed human experience. "I think, buddy, that maybe they're the ones who need to decide whether to trust us." The formation began to slowly ascend, and Connor felt his aircraft being released from whatever forces had been assisting his flight. He was once again flying purely on human technology, but the contrast made him acutely aware of how primitive his most advanced aircraft was compared to what surrounded him. "Control, they're beginning to withdraw. I think the demonstration is over." "Midnight Viper, what's your assessment of their intentions?" Connor considered the question as the alien craft began to fade from visibility, not through distance but through some kind of advanced stealth technology that made them disappear like morning mist. "They're not hostile," Connor said finally. "They're hopeful. They want us to succeed, but they're not going to force us to change. The choice is ours." As the last of the craft disappeared from view, Connor found himself alone in the sky above Washington, D.C., his F-22 once again, just an advanced human aircraft, rather than part of an impossible formation. Below him, he could see the crowds still gathered on the mall, pointing upward at empty sky that had moments before held the future of human civilization. "Dad, are you coming home now?" Dylan's voice carried relief and exhaustion. "I'm coming home, buddy, and I have a lot to tell you." As Connor began his flight back to Andrews, he found himself thinking about the choice that now faced humanity. The beings he'd encountered had made it clear that this was not a one-time offer. They would be watching, waiting to see how humans responded to the knowledge that they were not alone in the universe. "Control, Midnight Viper requesting landing clearance at Andrews." "Midnight Viper, you are cleared for landing. Be advised that there are a lot of people very eager to talk with you." Connor understood. What had just happened would require briefings that would last for days, analysis that would reshape government policy and decisions that would affect the future of human civilization. But first, he needed to see his son to ground himself in the human connections that had made this mission possible. "Dylan, are you still there?" "I'm here, Dad. I watched the whole thing on the screens. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." "What did you think of our visitors?" Dylan was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness that the situation deserved. "I think they seemed nice. Like they really wanted to be friends, but they weren't going to force us to be friends with them." The observation was delivered with devastating accuracy. Connor found himself smiling as he began his descent toward Andrews, carrying with him the weight of first contact and the hope that humanity might prove worthy of the gift it had just been offered. As the runway lights of Andrews Air Force Base came into view, Connor felt the familiar sensation of returning home after a mission that had changed everything. But this time the change wasn't just personal. It was species-wide, and the future that stretched ahead was filled with possibilities that had existed only in the realm of science fiction just hours before. The F-22 touched down smoothly, and as Connor taxied toward the hangar where Dylan and Martinez were waiting, he found himself thinking about Sarah and what she would have said about this moment. She would have been proud of Dylan's courage and wisdom, amazed by the technology they'd encountered, and hopeful about the future that such contact might make possible. But most of all, she would have been proud that when humanity's moment of first contact had come, it had been guided by love rather than fear, by hope rather than hostility, and by the wisdom of an 8-year-old boy who understood that sometimes being brave meant being willing to trust. As Connor shut down the engines and prepared to rejoin his son, carried with him the memory of flying among the stars with beings who had offered humanity a place in something far greater than any one world could contain. The choice of what to do with that offer would belong to everyone, but the knowledge that it existed would forever change how humans looked at the sky above them and dreamed about the future that awaited among the stars. The hangar doors slid open as Connor taxied the F-22 to its parking position, and he could see Dylan standing beside Martinez, his small figure dwarfed by the massive military personnel surrounding him. Even from the cockpit, Connor could see the mixture of relief and excitement on his son's face, the tension finally leaving the boy's shoulders as the aircraft came to a complete stop. As the engines wound down, Connor found himself taking a moment to process what had just occurred. In the span of a few hours, he had gone from being a civilian auto mechanic to humanity's first successful ambassador to an extraterrestrial intelligence. The weight of that responsibility was settling on him like a lead blanket, but underneath it was something else, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. The canopy opened, and Connor began the familiar ritual of post-flight shutdown, his hands moving automatically through procedures that had become second nature over thousands of hours of flight time. But everything felt different now, charged with significance that went beyond individual mission success. Dylan broke free from the group of officers and ran toward the aircraft, his face shining with pride and excitement. "Dad, Dad, I saw everything on the screens. You were flying with spaceships." Connor climbed down from the cockpit and caught his son in a fierce embrace, feeling the solid reality of Dylan's presence anchoring him back to the human world after his encounter with beings whose existence transcended normal understanding. "I was Buddy, and you were right about them wanting to be friends. I knew it." Dylan pulled back to look at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 8 years. They seemed nice on the radar, even when everyone else was scared. Martinez approached with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with personal concern. "Connor, I've been monitoring the global response to what just happened. We're looking at the most significant event in human history, and you were at the center of it. Miguel, I need to brief you on what I learned up there, but first, Connor looked down at Dylan, realizing that his son had been through an emotional ordeal that would challenge most adults. First, I need to make sure my boy is okay. I'm okay, Dad, Dylan said firmly. I was scared, but I knew you'd come back. And I kept thinking about what Mom would say about meeting people from other planets. The mention of Sarah hit Connor with unexpected force. What do you think she would have said? Dylan considered the question with the gravity that he brought to all discussions about his mother. I think she would have said that it's amazing how big the universe is and how there's always more to learn and more friends to make. The words were so perfectly Sarah. Her optimism, her faith in the fundamental goodness of new experiences, her belief that connection was always possible, even across the widest differences. Connor felt tears gathering in his eyes as he realized that his son had inherited the best of both his parents. Martinez was watching the exchange with obvious respect for the family dynamic, but Connor could see the urgency in his expression. The implications of first contact were rippling outward at light speed, and decisions needed to be made that would affect the future of human civilization. Connor, I hate to interrupt, but we have situation rooms full of officials from every government agency you can imagine. The president has been briefed, and there are calls coming in from world leaders. Everyone wants to know what you learned during that encounter. Connor stood, keeping one hand on Dylan's shoulder. The short version is that we've been invited to join something much larger than Earth. The longer version is going to require conversations that might take days. How much larger? Martinez asked. Think of it as a galactic community of civilizations that have all faced the same transition we're facing now. Some made it, some didn't. We're being evaluated to see which category we fall into. The implications were staggering, and Connor could see Martinez processing the magnitude of what this meant for military planning, diplomatic protocols, and fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. Dylan tugged at Connor's flight suit. Dad, when will we know if we passed the test? That's the thing, buddy. It's not really a test we can pass or fail all at once. It's more like growing up. We have to show that we're ready for more responsibility. Major Santos approached with a tablet containing preliminary analysis of the sensor data collected during the encounter. Sir, the technical readings we're getting are off the charts. These craft were operating with energy signatures that our best theoretical physicists say should be impossible. Connor took the tablet and scrolled through data that confirmed what he'd experienced firsthand. Major, I think we're going to need to expand our understanding of what's possible. The beings I encountered have been dealing with these technologies for thousands of years. Beings? Santos's eyebrows rose. You had direct contact with the occupants. Not physical contact, but mental communication. They shared concepts and images that I'm still processing. The statement sent a ripple of excitement and concern through the assembled personnel. Direct communication with extraterrestrial intelligence was the holy grail of contact scenarios, and Connor had achieved it on humanity's first successful encounter. Martinez was already pulling out his phone to update his superiors. Connor, this changes everything. We're not just dealing with advanced technology. We're dealing with active intelligence that has chosen to communicate with us. And they chose to communicate through Dad, Dylan added with obvious pride, because he's the best pilot and the bravest person they could find. Connor felt overwhelmed by his son's faith in him, but also by the magnitude of the responsibility that had just been placed on his shoulders. He was no longer just Connor Walsh, single father and auto mechanic. He had become humanity's primary liaison with an intelligence that could reshape civilization itself. Miguel, I need to ask you something important, Connor said. What happens to Dylan and me now? Our lives were complicated enough before this morning. Martinez looked thoughtful. That depends on several factors. How much involvement you want to have in ongoing contact efforts, how the government decides to structure response protocols, and what kinds of security considerations we're dealing with. Security considerations. Connor, you're now the most valuable intelligence asset in human history. There are going to be people who want to protect you, people who want to exploit you, and people who want to silence you. We need to think carefully about how to manage all of those pressures. Dylan was listening to this conversation with growing concern. Dad, does this mean we can't go back to our normal life? Connor knelt down to his son's eye level, understanding that this question was really about stability and security in a world that had just become infinitely more complex. Our life is going to be different, buddy. But the most important parts, you and me, our family, that's never going to change. But you might have to fly more missions like this one. The question cut to the heart of Connor's dilemma. The beings he'd encountered had made it clear that ongoing contact would be necessary, that humanity would need representatives who could serve as bridges between worlds. But every mission would carry risks, and Dylan had already lost one parent. Maybe, Connor said honestly, but if I do, it will be because it's the best way to help people and to make sure that you grow up in a world that's safe and full of possibilities. Dylan nodded with the serious acceptance that had marked his response to life's challenges since his mother's death. Will I get to meet them someday? The question surprised Connor. The beings from today, would you want to? I think so. They seemed nice, and I bet they know a lot of cool things about space and science. Connor found himself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. His son's curiosity and openness might be exactly the qualities that humanity needed to navigate this new reality successfully. Martinez was checking his watch with growing urgency. Connor, I really do need to get you into briefings. There are decisions being made right now that will affect how we respond to this contact, and your input is critical. What about Dylan? He can stay with Major Santos and the support staff. We've set up comfortable quarters with communication access so he can talk to you during breaks. Connor looked at his son, seeing trust and understanding in those bright blue eyes. Is that okay with you, buddy? I need to go talk to some important people about what happened today. Will you tell them that the space people want to be friends? I'll tell them everything I learned. As they prepared to separate for the briefings that would determine humanity's response to first contact, Dylan hugged his father tightly. Dad, I'm proud of you for being brave today. Mom would be proud too. The words hit Connor with devastating emotional force. He held his son close, feeling the weight of love and responsibility that had driven every important decision of his adult life. I love you, Dylan. No matter what happens in these meetings, no matter how complicated things get, remember that you're the most important thing in my world. I love you too, Dad. The briefing rooms at Andrews had been converted into a situation center that buzzed with activity from officials representing every branch of government and military service. As Connor entered the main conference room, he was struck by the diversity of uniforms and civilian attire that indicated the unprecedented nature of the crisis they were addressing. At the head of the table sat General Patricia Morrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, her expression reflecting the gravity of decisions that could reshape American foreign policy and military doctrine. Beside her sat Dr. Rebecca Chen, NASA's Director of Astrobiology, whose presence indicated that this briefing would cover scientific as well as military implications. Colonel Walsh, General Morrison began. Thank you for your service today. What you accomplished represents a breakthrough that will be studied for generations. We need to understand everything you experienced during that encounter. Connor took his seat at the briefing table, feeling the weight of expectation from the assembled officials. General, the beings I encountered have been observing human development for some time. Today's contact was an invitation to join a larger community of civilizations, but it comes with conditions. What kind of conditions? Dr. Chen asked. They want evidence that humanity can evolve beyond its current limitations. Specifically, that we can develop the wisdom and cooperation necessary to handle advanced technologies responsibly. General Morrison leaned forward. Are we talking about some kind of test or evaluation period? More like a probationary period. They'll continue to observe our progress, and if we demonstrate the qualities they're looking for, we'll gain access to technologies and knowledge that could solve most of humanity's current challenges. And if we don't meet their standards? Connor considered the question, remembering the images that had been shared with him during the mental contact. Then we continue on our current path, but without their assistance. They won't interfere, but they also won't help us avoid the consequences of our choices. The implications were sobering. Humanity was being offered a choice between guided evolution toward a cosmic perspective or continued struggle with planetary limitations and conflicts. Dr. Chen was taking notes rapidly. Colonel Walsh, can you describe the nature of the communication you experienced? Was it telepathic, technological, or something else? It felt like direct mind-to-mind contact, but whether that was natural ability or advanced technology, I couldn't determine. What I can tell you is that the information transfer was incredibly efficient. Concepts that would take hours to explain verbally were conveyed in seconds. What specific technologies did they indicate might be available? Connor pulled out his own notes, scribbled during the flight back to Andrews. Energy systems that could eliminate fossil fuel dependence, medical technologies that could extend healthy human lifespans significantly, and propulsion systems that would make interstellar travel practical. The room fell silent as officials contemplated the magnitude of what was being offered. These weren't incremental improvements to existing technology. They were revolutionary advances that could transform human civilization within a generation. General Morrison spoke first. Colonel, in your assessment, are these beings a threat to national security? No, General. If they wanted to harm us, they could have done so at any time. Their technology is so far beyond ours that resistance would be meaningless. They're not conquerors. They're potential mentors if we prove worthy of their guidance. And how do we prove worthy? Connor thought about Dylan's wisdom, about Sarah's optimism, about the choice that had brought him from a comfortable civilian life back into the cockpit of an advanced fighter to risk everything for strangers. By demonstrating that we can put cooperation above competition, that we can think beyond individual or national interests to consider what's best for our species as a whole, by showing that we're ready to be responsible members of a larger community. Dr. Chen looked up from her notes. Colonel, did they give any indication of time frame? How long do we have to demonstrate these qualities? They operate on cosmic timescales, but they also understand that human civilization is at a critical juncture. I got the impression that we have perhaps a generation to show significant progress. A generation to fundamentally change human nature, General Morrison said grimly. That's asking quite a lot. Connor thought about his son, about the 8-year-old boy who had demonstrated more wisdom about interspecies contact than most of the adults in this room. Maybe it's not about changing human nature. Maybe it's about choosing which aspects of human nature we want to emphasize. The briefing continued for hours, covering every detail of the encounter that Connor could remember. Technical specialists analyzed the sensor data, psychologists explored the implications of mental contact, and strategists began developing response protocols for future encounters. During a break, Connor was able to call Dylan, who had been following the proceedings through closed-circuit feeds that Major Santos had arranged. Dad, Are you telling them everything the space people showed you? I'm trying to, buddy. It's complicated to explain to adults sometimes. Are they understanding it okay? Connor looked around the room where officials were engaged in intense discussions about threat assessments and national interests, their voices reflecting the competitive thinking that had driven human civilization for millennia. Some of them are understanding it better than others, Connor said diplomatically. Do you think they'll make the right choice? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Connor found himself wondering whether humanity's leaders were capable of the kind of fundamental shift in perspective that this opportunity required. I hope so, Dylan. I really hope so. When the briefings resumed, Connor found himself fielding questions that revealed the depth of human anxiety about the contact. Officials wanted to know about alien military capabilities, about potential threats to Earth, about ways to gain technological advantages over other nations. General Morrison, Connor said finally, I think we're approaching this from the wrong angle. These beings aren't thinking in terms of military threats or national competition. They're evaluating whether we're ready to join a community that has moved beyond those concepts. Colonel, with respect, national security is my responsibility. I need to understand potential threats. I understand that, General, but I think the biggest threat we face is our own inability to think beyond the frameworks that have defined human conflict for centuries. Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. Colonel Walsh is right. If we respond to this contact with traditional military and political thinking, we're essentially proving that we're not ready for what's being offered. The room erupted in discussions that revealed the fundamental challenge facing humanity. The very institutions and thought patterns that had enabled human survival and progress were now obstacles to joining a larger cosmic community. Connor felt his phone vibrate with a text message from Dylan. Dad, tell them what I said about the space people wanting to be friends. The message crystallized something that had been building in Connor's mind throughout the endless briefings. An 8-year-old had grasped the essential nature of this contact more clearly than rooms full of experts and officials. Ladies and gentlemen, Connor said, his voice carrying the authority that came from being the only person in the room who had actually communicated with extraterrestrial intelligence. I want to share something that my son observed about today's encounter. The room quieted as officials turned their attention to him. Dylan watched the entire mission from the communications center, and his immediate assessment was that the beings we encountered wanted to be friends, but wouldn't force friendship on anyone who wasn't ready for it. That 8-year-old understood something that we're struggling with here. Connor paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected the weight of decisions that would affect human civilization. These beings aren't asking us to abandon our humanity or surrender our independence. They're asking us to grow up to become the kind of species that can be trusted with technologies that could reshape worlds, and they're willing to wait while we figure out how to do that. General Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Colonel, what's your recommendation for how we proceed? Connor thought about Dylan's courage in encouraging him to take the mission, about Sarah's faith in the fundamental goodness of connection, about the impossible grace of flying, in formation, with beings whose existence transcended human understanding. We start by choosing hope over fear, cooperation over competition, and wisdom over the immediate gratification of technological advantage. We prove that humanity is ready for this opportunity by becoming worthy of it. The briefings continued into the night, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Officials who had entered thinking about threats and advantages were beginning to consider possibilities and responsibilities. As dawn approached, Connor was finally released from the endless meetings and reunited with Dylan, who had fallen asleep in the comfortable quarters that Major Santos had arranged. Connor sat beside his son's bed, watching the peaceful face that reminded him so much of Sarah, and felt the weight of the day's events settling into perspective. Dylan stirred and opened his eyes immediately, alert, despite the early hour. "Dad, did they make good decisions in the meetings? I think they're starting to understand what kind of decisions need to be made. Are you going to fly more missions with the space people?" Connor considered the question that had been implicit in every discussion throughout the night. The beings had made it clear that ongoing contact would require representatives who could serve as bridges between species, and he was the only human who had successfully established communication. "Probably, buddy, but if I do, it will be to help build something amazing for your future." Dylan sat up in bed, his young face serious with the weight of understanding. "Dad, I think Mom would want you to do this. She always said that the best way to honor people we love is to make the world better for everyone." The words hit Connor with the force of revelation. Sarah's legacy wasn't just in the love she'd given them, but in the values she'd instilled that could guide humanity toward a future she'd never live to see. "You're right, buddy. She would want us to do this. Will it be dangerous?" Connor thought about the beings whose technology could destroy civilizations, but who had chosen instead to offer guidance and friendship. All the important things in life involve some risk, but some risks are worth taking. Dylan nodded with the acceptance that had marked his response to life's challenges since losing his mother. "Then I think we should do it. Together." Together. Connor agreed, feeling the future opening before them like a door to possibilities that had existed only in dreams just days before. 6 months later, Connor stood in the cockpit of a modified F-22 at Edwards Air Force Base preparing for his 15th communication mission with the beings who had become humanity's guides toward cosmic citizenship. Beside him in the passenger seat that had been added to the aircraft, Dylan wore a small flight suit and an expression of excitement that had become familiar during their joint missions. The boy had become an unofficial ambassador himself, his natural curiosity and openness serving as a bridge between human and alien perspectives that often proved more effective than any diplomatic protocol. "Dad, do you think they'll show us the new propulsion system today?" Dylan asked, as Connor completed the pre-flight checklist. "Maybe, buddy. They said we're making good progress with the cooperation protocols." It was true. In the months since first contact, humanity had begun the slow process of proving worthy of the gift they'd been offered. International cooperation on the Alien Contact Project had led to unprecedented collaboration on other global challenges. Wars hadn't ended overnight, but there was a new context for human conflict that emphasized species-wide rather than national interests. The breakthrough had come when Dylan had suggested during one of the communication sessions that the aliens might want to meet other children to understand how human young were being prepared for the cosmic future. The resulting cultural exchange had transformed first contact from a military and diplomatic challenge into an educational opportunity that involved schools and families around the world. "Control, this is Midnight Viper requesting clearance for departure," Connor transmitted. "Midnight Viper, you are cleared for takeoff. Safe travels and give our friends our regards." As the F-22 lifted into the Nevada sky, Connor felt the familiar thrill of flight enhanced by the knowledge that they were flying toward a future that had once existed only in science fiction. Dylan pressed his face to the window, watching the desert landscape fall away beneath them as they climbed toward the rendezvous point where their guides waited. "Dad, when I grow up, do you think I'll be able to fly spaceships to other planets?" Connor looked at his son, seeing in those bright blue eyes the same wonder and optimism that Sarah had brought to every new experience. The beings they were about to meet had indicated that interstellar travel would become possible within a generation, and that young humans like Dylan would be among the first to explore the galaxy. I think, buddy, that you're going to have opportunities that we can't even imagine yet. Will you come with me? Connor felt his throat tighten with emotion. As far as they'll let me, yes. As their aircraft approached the coordinates where the alien craft waited, Connor reflected on the journey that had brought them from a commercial flight where they'd been judged unworthy of first-class service to representing humanity in the most important diplomatic mission in the species' history. The transformation hadn't been his alone. Dylan had evolved from a boy grieving his mother's loss to a young ambassador whose wisdom often guided interspecies communication. Their relationship had deepened from father protecting son to partners building a future together. "There they are," Dylan said excitedly, pointing through the canopy at the graceful forms that materialized against the afternoon sky. Connor felt the familiar sense of awe as the alien craft approached their impossible elegance, a reminder that humanity was taking its first steps into a universe far more wondrous than any earthbound imagination could encompass. "Ready for another adventure, buddy? Always, Dad, always." As their aircraft joined the formation that would carry them toward humanity's next lesson in cosmic citizenship, Connor thought about Sarah and how proud she would be of the man Dylan was becoming and the future they were building together. The boy who had once comforted his father during turbulence was now helping to guide an entire species through the most significant transition in its history. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities that had once existed only in dreams. And at its center was the unbreakable bond between father and son, forged in loss and strengthened by hope that had become humanity's bridge to the stars.